All right, and we're live. The World Affairs Council of Greater Reading is the leading educational organization promoting understanding and enlightenment on global issues. Welcome this evening, our first evening presentation, our second virtual presentation. We are conducting the meeting for our members on Zoom. We're also streaming live to Facebook. So regardless of how you're joining us, we appreciate you being here. For our members on Zoom, we're going to keep everybody muted during the presentation. We've unmuted our guest and host for the evening, but you should participate. We're going to use the chat. I'll keep an eye on the Zoom chat for Q&A after the presentation. I'll also do my best to keep an eye on the Facebook chat, but Zoom is where Zoom will get the first whack. So if you're a member on Zoom and start entering your questions into the Q&A as soon as they come up. I will leave everybody muted. And for our friends on Facebook, please remember to like and share the stream so we can attract as many people as possible. Let me see, do I have any other quick announcements here? Nope, there we go. I'm going to turn the meeting over to the president of the World Affairs Council of Greater Reading, Lynn Brown.
Hi, welcome everybody, and welcome to those members of the World Affairs Council of Reading, as well as members joining from around the country. This is an event that's part of the C by C Amplified, an Ideas Summit presented by the World Affairs Councils nationwide. This week, councils from around the United States are working together to highlight the power of our network. We encourage everyone joining today to support your local World Affairs Council. Now let me introduce our speaker. He is Ron Granieri, and his topic is Europe in the Age of Corona. Ron is an Foreign Policy Research Institute's Templeton Fellow, the Executive Director of the Institute's Center for the Study of America in the West, editor of the center's e-publication called The American Review of Books, Blogs, and Bull, and host of Geopolitics with Ron Granieri, a monthly series of events for Foreign Policy Research Institute members. He's also Associate Professor of History at the U.S. Army War College. He's a specialist in contemporary German and international history with degrees from both Harvard and the University of Chicago. He's currently completing a book entitled The Fall and Rise of German Christian Democracy from Détente to Reunification for the Oxford University Press. We're delighted to have you this evening, Ron. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Lynn. It's great to be here, and it's great to be here with everybody online. This is a fun opportunity to speak to all of you in this age where we're all restrained a little bit. For me, the toughest restraint is I'm going to actually try to sit still. Usually I wander around when I talk. So this is the two things I promised that I would do as little as possible is touch my face and get up and walk around. And we'll see if I can live to both of those. We'll do just fine. So I am here to talk about Europe in the age of Corona. And I want to show you, I have some slides for the background, but they will be relatively light just to give us something to think about and also give you all something to look at, as I joke with Mike and Lynn, somebody who's not me. But I want to talk about, when we talk about Europe in the age of Corona, the big challenge is to figure out, what questions we're going to focus on. And usually I like to start a class and I say that we'll hit 3 big questions, and I managed to come up with 4. And actually, there's actually more than 4 here too, but just some questions I want us to think about that I'm going to talk hopefully for half an hour, a little bit more than half an hour, because I want there to be maximum time for questions from you. So if I seem to have skipped over something a little too superficially, it's because I'm hoping you'll ask me about it. But by all means, fire away once you've heard what I want to talk about. But I want to hit a few big points. And one of them is basically, as I say here, how has COVID-19 affected Europe as a whole? And what about the European Union as an institution? Because we're going to talk about that. When we say Europe in the age of Corona, what exactly are we talking about? Which problems raised by COVID-19 are new in themselves and which are merely intensified older problems. Spoiler alert, none of the problems that are raised by COVID-19 in European politics are new, and all of them are intensifications of existing problems, and we're going to come back to that in the discussion. Where does the Atlantic Alliance fit into all this? And I phrase that broadly because it's about European-American relations, yes, but actually a larger question of whether, when dealing with global issues, Europe, the European states, however defined, either individually or as the European Union, should they think of themselves as natural and inevitable allies of the United States within whatever we want to call, what we like to call it FPRI, the West, and we've called it for a long time, or are the Europeans looking to become free agents, if you will? And this is especially is what we're going to talk about when we bring up the issue of Chinese influence or lack thereof in Europe and in as an intervening force in the European-American relationship. And finally, what lessons should we draw from all this? That's where we may wander a bit into philosophical territory, but I may cut myself short there. But I want us to think about what does this all mean in the long term, right? Diseases come and go, political crises come and go, but none of them goes without leaving some sort of scar. And that's what we need to think about as we move forward. So to remind us the part of the world we're talking about Europe. But when I say Europe in the age of Corona, there is the Europe that all of you may be familiar with as a geographical expression. I always start every class I teach on the European Union or on European history by asking students where the eastern boundary of Europe is. Since I don't have a live audience in front of you, once again, a little bit of a spoiler alert, the usual response that I get, which is the sensible one, if you took geography in school, although some of us may be dating ourselves by saying that we took geography in school, but if you took geography in school, you learned that the eastern boundary of Europe is the Ural Mountains, which roughly correspond to the far right, and in fact, not quite, the far right border of this particular picture. Now, the Urals don't make a lot of sense as a border between continents, and indeed Europe is not in any geographical sense sensible as a continent. We allied that reality. And in fact, the whole history of Europe is about the negotiation and contestation of Europe's eastern boundary. Sometimes it was for the Romans, right? Europe's eastern boundary was the Rhine, because they figured anybody who lived on the other side of the Rhine was a dangerous barbarian and untamable. That boundary was pushed eastward and eastward. Then it was the Bosphorus. Then it was back to the city of Vienna. We could go back and forth on this. And even today, the question of Europe's eastern boundary is bound up with this issue of what are we talking about when we're talking about Europe? Because if we mean Europe as a geographical expression, then it would include pretty much every state that is covered on this map, right? With the possible exception of the states down below that are all identified simply as Africa. Which is that's a different problem, right? Since Africa is more than one place. But when we think about what is Europe, are we talking about the European Union, which is most of the states that are colored in this map at one time or another? So all the way up to the boundary with Belarus, with Russia, with Ukraine, with Moldova. Is that Europe? Is Europe everything that's to the left of that line, or does Europe include Russia, Belarus, Ukraine? Moldova? It probably does. So when we talk about Europe in this era, we're going to talk about the European Union as an institution, but we have this basic problem that any discussion about Europe has to address, and that is the idea that there are indeterminate boundaries within Europe. And as we go through a crisis situation with the European Union, as the European Union struggles with the departure of one of its members, right, this one over here, we realize that talking about the impact of anything on Europe is always going to lead us to challenging questions. And so we need to think about that. When we talk about Europe in the age of Corona, who are we talking about? What are we talking about? And then it's also worth noting that when we're talking about a global issue like this pandemic that is COVID-19, if we're thinking about it as a global issue, that we can focus on a particular region at a particular time, but we always realize that it is very much a product of globalization, that boundaries are hard to enforce with a pandemic disease. And yet, and this is what we're going to go back and forth against, is how do different political institutions attempt to draw their lines so that they know where they are responsible for dealing with a problem like COVID-19, and how should they understand, and how should the people who live within different boundaries understand it? So one of the issues we're going to get into is how within Europe itself, there are these competing pulls of local identity, local authority, and appeals to broader European solidarity. As you may be shocked to discover, some people generally are very jealous of their local authority when they have something they want to protect, but when they want help from other places, they are very quick to call on everybody else to show a degree of solidarity. And we should also note, and we're going to talk about the European Union, that the European Union, as the weird hybrid political institution that it is not a federal state. Whether it should be or not is a question we can hit on the Q&A. But because it's not a federal state, the whole issue of what does it mean to show solidarity within the European Union is itself an open question. And as we sit in the United States in a federal state that is struggling with the idea of how do you balance the authorities of local communities with any kind of coordinated efforts from the federal center, it's not an easy question. And so that's something to keep in mind in the background of this conversation. And I'll probably come back to it as we talk about specific places, but and in the Q&A as well. So any discussion about COVID is going to have to deal with certain questions and statistics. And it's funny putting this talk together, right? This is something of a moving target. We try to figure out, where are we in understanding the problem that Europe faces. And so I discovered the following, right? That as of May 5th, 2020, so as of yesterday, there have been 145,241 deaths in Europe overall due to the coronavirus since the first recorded European death in France on February 15th. The most deaths have occurred in Italy at 29,079. This is as of yesterday. April 4th was the virus's deadliest day so far in Europe, with 5,211 deaths on that day, recorded in 39 different European countries. So once again, this particular site that I drew this from, Statista, 39 European countries, that's bigger than the European Union, right? That's a definition of, that's a particularly capacious definition of Europe. So there were 5,211 deaths recorded in 39 different countries on April 4th. On May 5th, 1,580 deaths were recorded across 34 countries. So the worldwide number of confirmed cases of coronavirus was over 3.58 million as of May 4th, 2020. So it's a global problem. When we get into these discussions about numbers, right? Where is it worst? Who has suffered the most? You could argue if Europe were if the European Union were the integrated single state that Europeans like to talk about it as when they're dealing with happy issues like trade or or their total population, then the deadliest place in the world to live is Europe, is the European Union. That's more people have died in the European Union of COVID-19 than have died in the United States. It's close, but the United States is trailing. Now, of course, any discussion about the numbers, and this may come up in the questions as well, is whose numbers do we trust and what do the numbers mean? And that's an ongoing question. But truth is, the Europeans have suffered an enormous number of deaths. However, those deaths have been unequally shared within Europe, and that in itself is a political matter. And it's something that shapes the way not only that Europeans think about the disease and their response to the disease, but it's also a matter of how the Europeans think about how well their institutions are or are not functioning. For a long time, Italy was ground zero, like on this map on the left here, which is an early stage of the coronavirus. This is actually a map from March 9th, that Italy was far ahead of everyone else in terms of the confirmed cases of COVID-19 and in confirmed deaths. But the Italians, who have suffered terribly, have also gone through a period of lockdown that has resulted in the Italians maybe seeing a flattening of their curve. And as of the other day, right, the UK and France and Spain were all looking to perhaps catch up to Italy. And it becomes a real interesting question of policies, right? Not every state followed exactly the same policy at exactly the same time, even though if you look at the chart I have here in the middle, which I'll keep up for a good long time, that almost every European state eventually got to a point of national lockdown. Some of them very soon after their first case, some took quite a while. Only a few states have chosen to avoid the idea of a national lockdown altogether, right? On this chart, you'll see there are two blank spots, and one of them is Sweden, which we can talk about in a moment, and the other one is Belarus. Belarus, famously, Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, has officially said that COVID-19 is no big deal at all, that you can sit in a sauna, drink vodka, and it's not a disease, it's nothing to be afraid of. And oh, by the way, there's no coronavirus in Belarus, at least according to the government of Alexander Lukashenko. I'll leave that for anybody who's a specialist in Belarusian psychology to understand why that was necessary to do. But this is an interesting question, right? Because famously, of the most advanced economically and socially and politically states of Europe, Sweden is a little bit of an outlier because the Swedes decided to allow for a great deal of sort of voluntary social distancing rather than formal government lockdowns and closures. And depending on whom you ask, this has either made Sweden the great model that everybody needs to follow, or the great cautionary tale. Because while Sweden has not, as far as raw numbers, right? Sweden has many fewer deaths than a state like Spain, for example, or Italy. Sweden has substantially larger numbers of deaths per million residents than its closest neighbors, right? On your left there, you see Sweden is the black line above Denmark and Norway, right? Two states that Sweden interacts with a great deal. So the Swedes have had a lot of deaths. The Swedes would say, though, that those deaths have been concentrated in certain segments of society. I mean, sadly, a large percentage of Swedish deaths have taken place in homes for the aged. That they've had especially terrible death rates. But their societies as a whole, the argument is that Sweden is, by taking a somewhat more liberal approach, that Sweden managed to avoid having to do lockdown and is in the same ballpark as many of its neighbors. We can talk about that, whether that's actually the case. What we do know is that most European states, the overwhelming majority, in one form or another, decided to embrace a form of lockdown, hoping that this would reduce the spread, flatten the curve of the coronavirus, and to reduce deaths. These are all, one of the big problems with all of these discussions about flattening curves is they are only, if I can be a bit blunt, right? Deaths are a lagging indicator. Right, they come after infections, after people are sick, and it's only apparent in retrospect. As with so many things in history, right? It's only apparent in retrospect when you have reached your plateau or flattened your curve, right? You can hope that today was better than yesterday, or maybe today was not as bad as, maybe today was just as bad as yesterday. But long term, nobody in Europe has cracked the code to the extent that they could somehow get through this without anybody getting sick or without anybody dying. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, both when we're making comparisons between European states and we're making comparisons between Europe and the rest of the world. Because one point that is often brought up in the political discussion in the United States is obviously European states overwhelmingly have one form or another of national health care, either an insurance model as in Germany or a direct national health service model as in Great Britain, and a variety in between. And the existence of better or more extensive national health services has not in and of itself guaranteed that anybody avoids the coronavirus or avoids deaths by COVID-19. I mean, that's just flat out the case. I mean, you could argue that perhaps treatment is different in some places as a result of a wider array of health insurance. You could argue, I think, with some justification, that the fact that people in Europe don't have their health insurance connected to employment does help ease some of the fear that would come out of being locked down and not being able to work. But the mere existence of different healthcare systems has not shown an appreciable difference. In other words, you can't say that the states that are the worst with deaths are not necessarily the ones that have the least extensive national healthcare, and the ones that have some states have done better even with less extensive national health services. So this is the larger issue to keep in mind, is that we can talk about this as a European problem, a European development, but Europeans have experienced COVID-19, have experienced the coronavirus on the national level, or even on the local level. And so as a result, different leaders have had to struggle with how well they are handling this. And we've seen some interesting sort of rises and falls based on the way that different governments have handled it. So in Italy, for example, the government of Giuseppe Conte has had to deal with enormous tragedy, but after the heavy lockdown, and now that the Italians seem to be coming out of it, Italians have come away with a relatively positive view of their government. Meanwhile, whereas in France, for example, Emmanuel Macron has been struggling with a public that wants the government to do more, but doesn't completely know exactly what they want the government to do, and that Macron has been struggling to appear. He likes to appear to be very clearly in charge, and he's been struggling with that. Angela Merkel, who shows up in a few of these photos before you here, just as I say, to give you interesting people to look at. Angela Merkel has experienced an interesting comeback as a result of coronavirus and COVID-19, right? For somebody who in 2017 was barely able to win re-election and took a long time to put a government together and had been dealing with all sorts of internal problems and a great deal of criticism, the fact that she's one of the few heads of government in the world who is actually a scientist, even though she's not a epidemiologist, gave her a degree of gravitas in talking about the problems. The Germans instituted very quickly, in addition to their lockdown, instituted a very extensive program of testing, which has allowed the Germans to have a much lower death rate than many of their neighbors, certainly lower than Italy, lower than Spain, lower than France, lower than the United Kingdom, putting Germany actually on a path to begin to reopen its society, right? The Germans are in this week and next week will be allowing children to go back to school, will be reopening many public institutions. Now, Merkel has been very careful to say that if the numbers become alarming in any way, that they will go right back to lockdown. But the Germans, by following the path that is generally thought to be the best so far way to deal with this, which is a lockdown, yes, but also a heavy emphasis on testing and tracing and quarantining people who you know to be sick. The Germans have avoided many of the worst tragedies, and Merkel herself has seen her public approval ratings rise into the high 70s, and has seen in election polling for the next German national elections will be in 2021, have seen her party, the CDU, and their Bavarian sister, the CSU, they've made quite a recovery as well, getting back up into the high 30s in percentages, which is a big improvement over the last election. And the main sort of populist opposition party in Germany, the Alternative für Deutschland, the AfD, which had initially made great hay of criticizing Merkel's handling of these things, they've actually struggled. They've lost. They're back down into single digits in many polls. Now, whether that stays the same is a question. It is interesting that the AfD in Germany, along with other populists, such as in the picture here in the middle, such as Marine Le Pen and Giuseppe Salvini of the Lega in Italy, and Geert Wilders of the Partij voor Vrijheid in the Netherlands. Right, many of these populist countries have decided, populist parties have decided to embrace the open up the government, lift the restrictions approach, and be very critical of their governments for not doing enough to protect the unemployed. Whether that will eventually become a winning argument for populists does remain to be seen, and is worth watching to see how this goes. Because the Europeans, when you think about the way the Europeans have responded to this crisis, in the early stages, there was a great deal of criticism, in Italy in particular, that the other European states were not acting fast enough to help Italy as an EU member. And this actually opened the door for China to swoop in, if you will, and deliver supplies to the Italians and deliver supplies to other parts of Italy to emphasize their contribution to solving the problem that they strenuously deny that they caused in the first place. The Russians as well, who claimed not to have any significant problem with coronavirus, although that's not still, that is not currently the line of the Russian government. The Russians also tried to send supplies, sent a very high profile medical crew to Italy as a way to encourage the Italians, especially to encourage Salvini and the other critics of the European Union and of the Italian government, that their real friends were in Moscow, not in Brussels. That has faded somewhat, in part because it turns out that the supplies and the help that the Russians and the Chinese were delivering was not terribly helpful. And it is true that the European Union itself has, as an institution, has slowly gathered steam in order to provide possibilities for economic assistance. But there is still a long-term question about how, even in the existence of the European Union, public health is a national and local competency. And so it's not surprising that individual states were initially left on their own to figure out how to handle this. It becomes a European issue when we start talking about money. And that's where things are now. And so this gets me to thinking about how the question of aid for states that are hit hard by COVID-19, this intensifies one particular split. I'm going to move forward one slide, and I'll come back to the pictures in a minute. Whoops, where'd you go there? Nope. I don't know what happened to that slide. Oh well, all right, I guess I won't show you that slide because I managed to somehow delete it. But the problem of there is a north-south split in the European Union, and there has been for quite some time. And that north-south split goes back to the financial crisis of 2015, because this is states like Italy, Spain, Greece, Portugal. These were among the states that were hit hardest by the financial crisis and which needed bailouts and were often accused of being profligate and irresponsible in their spending. So you have this image of southern sinners and northern saints, the thrifty, well-organized Northerners complain that the Southerners have put themselves into debt, and the Southerners complain that the Northerners are not offering enough assistance to help them. This, you have seen those kinds of arguments appear in the discussion over the response to COVID. The European Union has been struggling as an institution, and northern states like Germany and the Netherlands in particular have been struggling with the question of how they can help enough to diffuse the criticism of the European Union while not offering so much help that they create domestic political problems for themselves. I mean, one of the great paradoxes of European politics is the same populist parties, such as the Lega in Italy, which complain about how much they hate the European Union, how terrible it is, also complain that the other states of the European Union aren't living up to their European responsibilities in providing assistance to Italy. It's a variation of the old joke that Woody Allen used in Annie Hall, the couple that goes to the restaurant and says the food here is terrible and the portions are so small. That the critics of Europe who want both, and that means that advocates of Europe also have to somehow do both. They have to both be generous and not judgmental, and that's not easy to do. But this north-south divide, which is exposed or deepened, if you will, by the COVID crisis, is not new. It is something that the Europeans still have to struggle with. Similarly, there is a governance issue, if you will, in the European Union between East and West. Whereas the Western European states, like from Germany and Italy westward, right? These are states that have relatively stable and healthy, if fragmented and contentious, political orders. And so while there's a lot of disagreement and political finger pointing and the usual stuff you'd expect to find in a crisis, democracy, if you will, Republican forms of government are doing all right. Whereas in Eastern Europe, in the former states of the communist bloc, where democratic governance is a little less firmly established, you have regimes that are using this crisis to, let's say, turn up the level of authoritarian control. In the middle of my group of pictures here is Viktor Orban in Hungary. And Orban and his Fidesz party have been, they are, as I try to say this in the least judgmental way possible. Let's say Orban is a good example of an extreme majoritarian. In other words, because Fidesz has a very clear majority electorally and claims to represent the majority of the people of Hungary, they then identify themselves, Orban and Fidesz identify themselves and their supporters as the country. And so therefore, what is good for the country is good for Fidesz. What is good for Fidesz is good for the country. And that means in this time of crisis, Orban has called for, and Fidesz has voted for, a de facto suspension of suspension of politics, right? The prime minister has now a great deal of emergency power to enforce and give and help create laws in order to deal with the crisis. Now, defenders of Orban will say these emergency powers are time limited, although the wording of that time limit is that when the government decides that the emergency is over, they will give the powers back. There are I can think of a few historical examples in European history, especially in the early part of the 20th century, let's say in the decade of the 1930s, when governments chose to grant emergency powers to heads of government who then decided not to give them back. I can also think of countries where there have been emergency powers that have been given back. So we don't know what Orban's long-term actions will be, but it is interesting that we're seeing in the debates within Europe about how to deal with the crisis, this East-West split between a Western Europe that is always wants to pride itself on its constitutional liberal order and criticizes the states of the East, like Hungary, like Poland, like the Czech Republic, like Slovakia, criticizes them for somehow backsliding or falling away from the one true faith. It is going to be interesting to see. As of right now, it's not clear that one approach or the other is better for dealing with the crisis. But it is an interesting question of how an interesting thing to consider, that how the way that societies deal with crises will reflect existing attitudes and preferences. And so there's that East-West split. And then there is the other split that existed before the COVID crisis, which is still very clearly with us. And that is, it's not as neat as East-West and North and South. I could call it the Atlantic split. I could call it the global split. I could call it the EU and everybody else split. But it is precisely this question of whether there is such a thing as Europe that can act as a single unitary actor, and how that should look in the world. So this is a problem for governance of the European Union, the relationship of the European Union to its member states. And what do you do, especially with those states in Europe that are not members of the European Union? What do you do with the United Kingdom? What do you do with Russia? States that are very influential, that are right there in the neighborhood, and yet what should their reaction be, and what should the relationship between Europe and the United States be? I hinted at this problem of Chinese influence, and this past couple weeks there was an especially interesting example here, where a report by the European Union about Chinese misinformation, about misinformation in general, dealing with COVID, was pointed out that both Russia and China had engaged in politically motivated misinformation campaigns. The Chinese complained vigorously about the charge that they had somehow been engaged in misinformation about either the existence of, the origins of COVID, or how it's being dealt with, and that a member of the staff of the European Parliament, the European Commission, that was dealing with this, was writing this report, leaked to the New York Times that the parts of the report were watered down to satisfy Chinese demands. The European Commission denies directly that there was any substantial change, but one can see, even in the actions of Angela Merkel and of other European leaders, of Emmanuel Macron even, a reluctance to be too directly critical of China, even as, let's say, other world leaders, right? President Trump has not been shy about criticizing Chinese behavior in this. And this is an interesting long-term question that one could, it will be a part of the global history of the 21st century will be about Chinese success or failure in prying Europe and the United States apart from each other. I would say that the Chinese so far are displaying exactly the sort of understanding of public opinion that you would expect from a society that is comfortable in throwing people in jail for having opinions they don't like. That the Chinese have been pretty heavy-handed in trying to pressure the Europeans. And this is not necessarily helping them. But it is going to be a question. One of the things that happens within the European Union is every 6 months, one of the member states assumes the presidency of the European Council. And so that member state then hosts the summit of the leaders and is allowed to be, to use an old TV reference, is allowed to be queen for a day and set the agenda for all of Europe. And it just so happens that the second half of this year, the presidency of the European Union will be held by Germany. And earlier this year and last year, when the Germans were talking about what they were going to do in their presidency, there was a lot of talk about how they were going to discuss Europe's global role and especially Europe's relationship with China. In the last week or two, however, in the wake of this recent scandal or recent trouble with the Chinese, the Germans have issued sort of new announcements about what they're going to talk about as president of the European Council, and the emphasis is on pandemic response and financial assistance. And suddenly there are many fewer references to China and relationships between Europe and China. Whether that will continue to be the case remains to be seen as well, because Xi Jinping is due to visit Berlin later this year. And so how this question will come up will be big. But as you know, I'm not telling this audience anything they don't already know, that relations between the individual states of the European continent and the European Union and the United States, their traditional ally, have been challenging over the past couple of years. And the COVID crisis, if you will, has, as with all these other chasms, fault lines, whatever you want to call them, right, has intensified those disagreements. Because it's not clear that the United States and the Europeans are on the same side. Or not on the same side, it's not what I mean. I mean in the sense that they're not in agreement about the proper policies to follow. The Europeans, for example, spearheaded a summit among the G20 states to raise money for a joint approach to a vaccine against COVID-19. The Europeans have pledged something on the level of $8 billion. The United States declined to participate in the summit and has declined to participate in this joint project as a political matter. That the United States does not want to be tied into everybody else's actions. You know, to a certain extent, right? Having multiple lines of attack in dealing with a possible vaccine for COVID-19 is not a bad thing, but it is worrisome potentially when the United States and Europe, in the face of the largest global crisis that we faced in a long time, that instead of pulling together, that they are drifting apart. And that's something to consider going forward. So I am just about near the end of my promised 30 minutes or so. there is a lot to talk about, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have about Europe in the age of Corona, where we go from here. One of the hardest things, trying to understand what's going to come after a crisis while a crisis is ongoing is like trying to change the oil on a moving car. I suppose you could do it, but you'll end up pretty bruised when it's all over. But I'm happy to talk about what's going forward and what's happened so far. So I'll take whatever questions you have. Thanks very much for your attention.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you. I've got a couple questions here. I will take a moment here just to remind everybody that if you do have questions, we can take those in chat. Now is the time. Oh, I don't want to end the meeting for everyone here. Let me just move this window out of the way. So now is the time to get your questions into chat. I've got a couple. I will also just take a quick opportunity here to remind everybody that we do have our members here on Zoom. We're going to take the live chat Q&A with our members on Zoom. If you are here as a guest, we certainly would invite you to go check out the organization. And to our members that are on now with us today, we are we're doing our membership drive for the next programming year right now. And that would be a great time to renew your membership so we can keep this kind of stuff going. And with that, I will jump back into the Q&A. This was, I mean, what a shocking presentation, right? The first death in France was mid-February, and now here we are just 2.5 months later, and the world feels like a completely different place.
Yeah.
With respect, like you mentioned that it's going to leave scars, right?
Mm-hmm.
What about the political scars? Towards the end, you kind of mentioned that, we've got these deepening chasms, and this is amplifying that. There is negotiation going on with respect to the boundaries around who's paying for what. What are going to be the long-term implications on what's essentially going to be the power being negotiated right now?
I mean, that's a good question. And I within individual states, it remains to be seen sort of how governments are held responsible by their populations. What I'm seeing so far when I look at polling is in most individual states, people are willing to be indulgent about their own government, right? I'm not aware of any particular government that's seeing its popularity plummet because of what's going on. However, the question of how should the European Union act, we're back to having discussions that we had in 2015 about when you consider how wealthy Europe is, when you consider how tied together, especially the members of the Eurozone are, should there not be some kind of common instruments for raising money in a situation like this? And in the wake of the 2015 crisis, right, they developed the European Stability Mechanism to give money to the Greeks and the Italians and the Spanish. But now even then people were saying, what about some kind of common debt instrument that would be shared across the entire Eurozone? And this concept of Eurobonds is that this was the thing that the Northern Saints refused to do, because the idea is that essentially that would be a bond that everybody would enjoy the benefits of being able to borrow on those bonds, but they would essentially be backed by the couple of stronger economies. Essentially, the Germans would pay for them. And so the Germans and the Dutch have always dug in on this. But in the last couple of weeks, the Germans and the French have expressed some openness to the idea. Ironically, it's the Dutch in particular who've decided to dig in their heels and be anti-corona bonds, as they call them. But I do think that this is, once again, the Europeans have an opportunity. I remember when one of my early teaching experiences was at a delightful college in South Carolina, Furman University, and I had a colleague there in the education department who was South Carolinian through and through from the backwoods. And he had a great accent and loved to say things. He was in the education department, and he would never say a bad thing about a student. And what he would say, if a student was doing really badly, he would say that this young person has unlimited potential for growth. And so the European Union still has, that you could see this as an opportunity that the European Union can finally deal with this issue of some kind of common financial instrument. It's a chance to do it. I don't know if they will.
Yeah, so on the tails of that, we've had a couple presentations here about Brexit by our own Dr. Noonan from Penn State. And on a related question, Bill Litvin asks, are there any other countries likely to exit
Yeah.
in a Brexit-style relationship with the EU as a result of this?
This is a great question, because certainly in the early stages of the crisis, the Italians were getting quite worked up over the idea that Brussels wasn't helping. And the Lega and other Italian Eurosceptics were saying this is why Italy has to leave the European Union. But that really strong emotion faded to the point where there is not a lot of enthusiasm for leaving the European Union right now. In fact, this is one of the great paradoxes when we think about some of the states that are the most critical of the European Union within it, like Viktor Orban in Hungary. Now, Orban's not talking about leaving the European Union. The European Union is a fantastic gravy train for Hungary, and especially for people who are connected to Fidesz. And so he doesn't want to leave. And so there has, skeptics, critics of the European Union, have been predicting the destruction of the European Union since about 1951 in its various forms. And at the same time, right, supporters of the European Union are always saying, right, the great moment, this crisis, the great moment of coming together is just around the corner. And one of the fascinating things about studying that history is nobody's right? Instead, the institution continues to exist. And so far at least, the EU as an institution has been able to deliver well enough that others haven't been willing to leave. The British are an interesting special case. And even the British have been struggling with whether they should or shouldn't participate in various European pandemic response programs, even as they're supposed to be negotiating the final terms of Brexit, right? After it's happened, yes, and we're in the middle of the transition period. But now even the British are talking about, right, they might have to delay the transition because they're busy with dealing with COVID. And so, I leave it, we can have another debate about whether people should leave the European Union or not. But I will say that what is interesting is, as of right now, there's not a lot of enthusiasm for leaving it.
And on Facebook, Keanu Gate had asked that question about the negotiations between the UK and the EU. Who do you sense kind of has the power in that conversation right now?
I to a certain extent, right, the European Union has control, has a lot of influence in this, because they know the British want to leave. And they know that the government of Boris Johnson is determined not to ask for an extension. So if I know you're not going to ask for an extension, then I am more likely to hold out. One of the fascinating things about the psychology of Brexit is Brexiteers have often operated as though they're the only ones that have national interests, and they're the only ones who should get what they want. And they've been consistently running into this problem, as the Europeans actually have been driving pretty hard bargain. Now, both sides need to understand that Britain's not coming back to the European Union, not in the near future, maybe not ever. And so there's no need for anybody to damage this relationship forever. And yet there is a strong tendency on both sides to play chicken, or to hope that, well, either I'll get what I want, or if I don't get what I want and there's no deal, I can blame the other guy for it. And yet, so these negotiations are supposedly still ongoing. I didn't talk a lot about Britain in my broad presentation, but I want to throw out something about it. And that is one of the, Boris Johnson getting sick was a terrible shock for a lot of people, for a lot of politicians in Europe, because they sort of had this idea that they were protected. You have all these bodyguards. How could anybody possibly get to you? Right. Well, we forget, right? COVID doesn't care if you have bodyguards. And if you
mean it can affect anyone?
Yeah. How about that? Right. I mean, and yet one of the things that it revealed as well, though, is that Johnson's administration, it revealed both a constitutional problem and a political problem. The constitutional problem is there's no such thing as a vice prime minister in British constitutional life. So even though people think of the foreign minister or the chancellor of the exchequer as the most senior ministers in a cabinet, there is nothing written down. And of course, the British don't have a written constitution. There is no specific rule that says if the prime minister is sick, person X gets to be prime minister. So that's one problem. And so when all the time Boris Johnson was sick, it was unclear who spoke for the British government. And then there's a political problem that's been pointed out by several critical commentators, that Johnson's government does not have very many large national personalities in it outside of Boris himself. And so he likes it this way, that not only is there sort of constitutionally nobody to be his replacement, but politically there's nobody who has enough of an independent political heft to speak for Britain in his absence. Which, that's great if the guy in charge, the person in charge is so is vigorous and able to do what he wants to do. It's a real problem when that person is himself recovering from a disease that almost killed him.
Yeah, and as we talk about these like political shifts, negotiations around the response, have we seen like a shift in military postures, or is everybody kind of just dealing with the logistics of getting through the short-term emergency?
Mostly it's getting through the short-term emergency. It is interesting that NATO had planned a major exercise this spring, Defender 2020, which was supposed to demonstrate NATO's continued cooperation and continued preparedness, especially vis-a-vis Russia. And of course they had to cancel it because of COVID-19. And so, but at the same time, NATO has been very visible as a deliverer of medical equipment. So military forces have helped to deliver medical equipment, have helped to move emergency airlift, moving people around. And so NATO has tried to emphasize its continued significance as something that binds Europe and the United States together, that binds the UK and the European Union member states together. And so there is a desire to show that that's all still there. But there have been a lot of worries. There was a very interesting piece by Jakob Grigel in the American Interest, I think it was last couple weeks ago, worrying about, if the Chinese see that a virus can essentially undermine NATO preparedness, then does that increase the possible interest of different states would have in using some kind of bacteriological warfare in the future?
So if we kind of bridge it to us, right? I mentioned Dr. Randy Noonan before. He's on the presentation today and asked, how do you see Europe's response in comparison to the response in the USA? Are they generally doing better than us? Not the same?
Yeah, that's a
comparison to be drawn there.
Is there? I mean, it's a great question, and it's one of the ones that I've been really struggling with when I was preparing this presentation, because as I said at the beginning, right, one of the real challenges is there is no Europe in the way that there is a federal government in the United States. So, and yet even the United States, which has a federal government, is struggling with the relationship between the states and the federal government. So I guess in that sense, right, Americans shouldn't be surprised that the European Union has had a hard time organizing a central response, because the United States of America is clearly having difficulties, especially when deciding, what's the role of the federal government, what's the role of the states. As trying to figure out, how the numbers work, right? Are we talking about, total numbers of deaths? As I say, if you're comparing the United States to any one state in Europe, the United States is far and away ahead. But if you're talking about per capita, then it gets a little closer. And if you talked about, the total number of people within the boundaries of the things we call Europe, I'd say the Europeans are doing worse than the United States. And this is where certain social pathologies, aging populations, the aging populations, concentrated cities, these sorts of things make societies vulnerable in some ways to the spread of a virus like this. Whereas the United States, we're more spread out. We are relatively, as societies go, right, we are younger than many of the states of Europe as far as our median ages go. And so in that sense, the Europeans were facing a particularly dangerous threat. And so I wouldn't, and that's where it goes back to the idea is, we could argue that if the United States had a better national healthcare system, that people would be dealing with the health concerns better. But the European experience shows us that having a national health service doesn't mean a lot of people aren't going to die of COVID-19.
Yeah, who's coordinating that in Europe? Lou Celeste from Facebook asks, is there a health organization within the EU, and what has been their response? I
mean, in general, there is not. I mean, there are health commissioners, there are European organizations, but national health is explicitly within the European Union a national competency. So, it's up to each individual national minister of health. So that's the problem is institutionally, when the discussion is about European coordination, it's really about spending money, because that's something that the European Union can do, but it's not about imposing any particular kind of policy. and whether this kind of crisis will make Europeans think, well, we need more federal competencies centralized. Well, then we're back to the political question of whether the European Union moves more towards a federal system than it is now.
Yeah, it's hard not to draw more comparisons to the U.S. in that light too.
Indeed.
So linking back to the U.S., you had mentioned that we are seeing some of these populist anti-quarantine protests around the world. I know we've seen, I guess I don't have a sense of like how widespread it is, but when it happens, it's certainly very widely publicized. So in light of like, how slow can we take this? What's there's probably not a historical precedent, but like at some point we'll have to find a middle ground between the way things were and the way things are now. Do we have any indicators of what that might look like?
Well, I mean, if we look at the German example, the idea that a society that can roll out very broad and extensive testing so that people can know whether or not they are infected, whether or not they carry the antibodies, that testing and then contact tracing of people who test positive for the disease, so that those people who test positive for the disease can take themselves out of circulation for the time it takes for the disease to run its course. That's the model, right? That if we do that, then you allow gradually, people will know whether they should be out in public and what they should do, and then you open up. Like the way that the Germans are hoping to do this is you open the schools up gradually, you open the shops up gradually, you let people circulate in public, but you encourage them to wash their hands, wear masks, a little bit of distance, but at least you're able to live your life and work. And that gradually then you can let everybody back into society. But I think the United States is, one of the things people are going to talk about for a long time is, what have we done with the time that we've had? Have we developed the testing and tracing ability until we can get to a vaccine? Because eventually you hope you'll get to a vaccine, like a flu vaccine, that will mean that this may be something that's chronic, and maybe something that comes back, but it doesn't have to be catastrophic every time that it happens.
Yeah, you mentioned that the tracing and that Germany's handled this well a couple times. I think early on we'd hear South Korea really was on top of it, responded very quickly with widespread testing and tracing. Is that kind of the model for dealing with this successfully? That
seems to be the model. I mean, there were a couple of other models that people thought were successful that have turned out not to be. I was reading an article in the Times today about Singapore. Which is they seem to, by closing the borders basically and encouraging people to distance but not shutting down, they looked like they were handling it. But now they're facing a massive spike in COVID cases among guest workers who live in these very crowded dormitories, and they're realizing that it's like for those of us old enough to remember when there were smoking and non-smoking sections on airplanes. You can say, row 11 is smoking and row 13 is non-smoking. But if somebody in row 11 is smoking, so is somebody in row 13, right? And that's where societies have discovered that it's not that easy to sort of say, well, maybe we got a problem over here, but it'll never reach over here. And so, but the long term, I would say that the successful model is, that you don't just lock down for the sake of locking down. You lock down so that you can develop the testing and the tracing capability so that you can then unlock. But if you just lock down until you're impatient to get back out, then you create a situation where people are no better protected now than they were then.
Yeah. So I mean, not to kill the analogy, right? But if row 11 refuses to stop smoking, that doesn't mean I should just keep smoking, right? It's also my interest to stop smoking. So do we, and we're seeing some of that. I mean, obviously in the US, all the states are connected geographically. You can cross borders very easily. Similar in the European Union. So in the US, we see this idea that states regionally are working together to try and have a little bit more coordinated effort, since it's not being driven as cohesively nationwide. Jerry Sieber asked if there's a similar effort among the European nations.
That's a very good question, and not that I can see. Certainly not to the extent that we have the states in the U.S. In part because, at least as of now, there's not the same kind of the gap that existed, say, between the European Union and the individual states has narrowed rather than widened. Whereas when we talk about the situation in the U.S., right, it's one of the reasons why many states have decided to band together is because they feel as though the federal government is simply not going to do what they needed to do. And so that's, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. No, I was going to kind of take it back to the interconnected nature of the financial system. There aren't really American companies and European companies. These are all multinational, global companies. Is everybody still just totally in crisis mode, or do we have some sense of, financially how this could end up shaping up?
I mean, I would say that we are still, the global stock markets have stabilized after but that stabilization might be partially because everything else in the global economy is so terrible, right? Stocks are the only place for people to put their money. But there is a certain, the financial markets have stabilized. The oil markets have stabilized somewhat, and oil prices have crept back up, even though they're still at very low levels. I think that the expectation that there will be, some kind of a return to business as usual is still out there enough to keep people from despairing. But the numbers that people are reading is we're still expecting there will be a recession, and it will be pretty bad. And then how long it takes to recover from it will be very closely tied to how quickly we figure out, where do things reach equilibrium when people can go back to work, but even if the disease is still out there.
What are the positive signs we can start looking for? I read an article recently about how 30 million unemployed, right? And we saw the same thing going into the Great Depression. A flood of unemployment is initially met with sympathy and support, and we're willing to fund that, but invariably it turns to why are we supporting these loafers who apparently just suddenly decided to stop working, randomly,
no,
right?
I think that the hopeful view is that since the shutdown, the various lockdowns and the sort of the end of economic activity was so abrupt that you can expect to have sort of a deep dive and then a very quick recovery when things get back to normal. The real challenge is going to be to deal with we talk about scars, to deal with the financial scars of smaller businesses, medium-sized businesses, mortgage holders who for a couple of months suddenly had no income. And if they missed payments on loans, if they suddenly are, do they have to file for bankruptcy if they're in default? And so this is going to be a matter for the financial markets. It's going to be a matter for governments as well, and for to work out some kind of, we can't expect that there's going to be some kind of debt jubilee, but I do think that if we want to have that recovery, that there's going to have to be some kind of pretty significant. I guess the only word there was pretty significant bailouts where people are either going to be able to, you're going to be able to start again because you can't make up for the 2 months that you were making zero, but you can at least start again. And that's not something that the markets are going to do by themselves. I just don't think so. So that's going to become an interesting political question for the governments of the European Union, for the government of the United States. And we're going to be having that discussion in the middle of a presidential campaign.
Yay.
That's right. Yay. Everybody's excited about that.
It seems like we're kind of winding down a little bit here. If anybody has any questions, you can still get them into the chat. So prepare for the idea of preparing for the worst has kind of like taken on a whole new meaning, right? When businesses think about what's the worst thing that can happen, I don't imagine a lot of them thought they just would be completely shut down for months on end.
Right.
Is there any sign that we're learning what we need to learn from this?
Oh man. What I really worry about is human beings don't learn anything, right? Is we like to think that we're ready for terrible things to happen, but really we just spend most of our time hoping they won't happen, right? And then when they do, as soon as we recover from the initial shock, we just tell ourselves, well, that was terrible. It's a good thing that's never going to happen again. And that's a natural human response. But it's also really kind of dangerous, because how do you prepare? I mean, what would being prepared for this have looked like? That's what I can't figure, right? If you read a story, I mean, heck, if you read a story in January, let alone last June, about, be ready this winter because there's going to be a disease that's going to be so terrible and so infectious that you're going to have to stay locked in your house for 2 months. How many people would be in a position to do anything? They might read that and be scared, but what are they going to do? When I first started being interested in studying international history, I did a lot of reading about nuclear war and nuclear war preparation. And the biggest shock to discover is nobody really knew how to be prepared for what came after. And to be truly prepared would have meant making huge changes in people's day-to-day lives. And most governments just decided, and most individuals decided, I don't want to make those big decisions, those big changes. So I'm just going to hope it doesn't happen.
Yeah, and you're right. That's kind of just the reality of the situation.
Yeah, that's right. I'm not criticizing anybody for that, because I wasn't ready to be stuck at home for 2 months either. So.
Yeah, we're good at underestimating the possibility of bad things happening. Sure, it's not going to happen to me.
It's not going to happen to me. Exactly.
Said that. So I did apparently shake a few questions loose.
Oh, good.
Tom Schmoyer from our chat here, member of the organization, asks, how does the defunding of the WHO play into the overall situation?
I mean, I think one of the ways that it plays into is when we talk about the gap or the fault line between the United States and Europe is, what everyone thinks about how the WHO has handled the crisis, and what everyone thinks about the way that the WHO has dealt with China, which I would say is pretty awful, right? The WHO showed itself to be more interested in not offending the Chinese than in being honest about a lot of things, right? To the extent where when Taiwan was doing a good job of dealing with coronavirus, the WHO officials refused to even say the word Taiwan in meetings because they knew they'd get angry hate mail from Beijing for doing it. That the Europeans are still heavily invested, literally and figuratively, in the idea of multilateral institutions. And so while they think the WHO has made mistakes, they still believe that being part of those institutions is important both symbolically and practically. And so for the United States to use this opportunity, I mean, the United States has always been more skeptical about multilateral institutions than the Europeans, but for the United States to take this crisis as a reason to make this sort of very vigorous anti-WHO act drives a political wedge between Europe and the United States. So it's like the United States wants to hit China, but they're smacking transatlantic relations instead, right? And that's what I think is problematic. And so it doesn't have to be the end of the world. I mean, the United States hasn't announced that it's wants to abolish the WHO. I mean, it's just the United States has decided to withhold funding. So it doesn't have to be the end of the world, but it does show this divergence between the United States and Europe, which is worth watching.
Sure. All right. So one more serious question, and then I'll finish this off on a high note. I've got a fun one here.
Outstanding.
So Ken Ugate again from Facebook, a fairly deep question here. Should Hungary continue to regress democratically from this crisis? What kind of effect would we expect that to have on the European Union?
I mean, Hungary gives me a lot of agita. I'm a big fan of Hungary. I think it's a great place. It's got a wonderful and complicated history. I think the Viktor Orban of 1990, who was the product of a scholarship program that allowed him to study in Oxford, right? A scholarship program that was funded by George Soros, allowed Viktor Orban to study in Hungary, and he came back and was a real leader in helping to democratize and liberalize Hungary. Viktor Orban in a lot of ways is a very important world historical figure. This sliding into, as I say, majoritarian authoritarianism. So if we think about there's democracy, which is people get to vote. But then there's sort of liberal democracy or liberal institutions is that in addition to people voting, there are also institutions that guarantee individual rights that are not solely dependent on the will of the majority. And the temptation to conflate the majority with everybody is not unique to Hungary. It's not unique to Europe. It's not unique to the 21st century. It's one of the basic problems of democracy is, it's one, you can win an election, you can take power, but are you going to govern for the good of everybody or not? And so what Hungary is doing is understandable in some ways, and it certainly has other historical parallels, but is dangerous because it undermines confidence in liberal institutions. And just as overreaction by Hungary's neighbors doesn't help either, because it's just sort of, you get escalation. But the European Union is going to have to, at some point, get serious about, you're supposed to, joining the European Union meant you embraced not only the specific sort of administrative rules of the European Union, but you embraced its basic ideas about democracy, the rule of law, liberal institutions. And the EU can't allow its member states to enjoy all the benefits of membership and flout those other rules. And that's what I think is the great paradox is Hungary loves to criticize the European Union, but they're not leaving. And Orban will tell you, right, that the goal is, right, they say they want to save their European Union by showing where everybody should go, but they're not leaving. And there's a level of dishonesty in the rhetoric about Hungary that, there's a part of me that thinks that there needs to be some kind of legitimate external pressure put on Hungary to rethink their positions. But of course, in the short and medium term, any pressure from the European Union to get Hungary to change is only going to make Orban more able to claim that he's being oppressed by these Western cosmopolitan elites who are trying to tell Eastern Europeans what to do. So, my sincere hope is that Hungary will find a way to, Hungary can, if somebody in the European Union has to be, right, further in one direction than another on any particular political question, just like in any country. And there have to be people who are more extreme in one direction than another, as long as we're all within some kind of broader consensus. And I don't think there's any danger or any problem with Hungary being more interested in cultural homogeneity than other states of Europe, right? That's somebody can be more than somebody else. But and this is the problem that the European Union so broadly, so I'll end on this philosophical note before I go to the fun thing. And that is that the Europeans need to ask themselves, what's the point of all this, right? Is it just to keep muddling along or just to assume because we're next door neighbors, we should all be part of one institution? Or is there something that makes Europe Europe? And Hungary's not wrong. And Orban is not wrong to say that the Europeans need to confront this question. And that's where we talk about issues like immigration and issues like, how does Europe deal with its history? How does Europe deal with its Christian heritage, right? These are real legitimate questions that Europeans need to ask themselves, right? What is it that makes Europe Europe? So that even if you're going to be open to people coming to Europe from someplace else, when they come to Europe, what are they coming to be a part of? And what do the Europeans who are already here think that they are a part of while they are in it, right? A bunch of, old buildings are nice, right? And historical museums with lots of old pictures, those are nice too. But not only do we need to know who these people are and what these buildings are, we need to think about what they mean for us today, right? Otherwise, they're just sort of like Gothic cathedrals, which are beautiful, empty, echoing with the footsteps of people looking around who don't even know what they see, right? And that's not a future that Europe should embrace, right? So Europe needs to think about these things. And so, we can do better, right? But I think I happen to believe that Europe can be both true to itself as Europe and respect minority rights, be open to the world, be democratic. I wish Viktor Orban thought that too.
Let's talk about hope then. And then
let's talk about, bring it on.
Run this down, right? So I know for me, I run, I ride, I'm in a pretty rural area, so it's safe to do that outside. And I see more of my neighbors out walking their dogs and spending time with their kids than I have ever seen in the 20 years that I've lived in this house. I have spent more time on Zoom with people than I would ever have sitting across from them in coffee shops. So on one hand, we're more isolated. On the other hand, almost feel more connected, right? Is there an indication of this on a broader scale? Like, what are the bright spots in the response here?
I mean, I think the bright spot is just think about how much harder this would have been 10 years ago, 20 years ago, right? When you might have been able to pick up the phone and dial somebody and talk to them for a little bit. But I mean, we need to think about this all the time. Like my phone is over here, and I think to myself, right, this is something that this would be Dick Tracy level fantasy, right? The idea, my wife has an Apple Watch, and I always think about Dick Tracy with this two-way, video watch, right? The fact that we can be as connected as we are, and that we've had to be creative in these last days, when my son with his school, with my wife with her work, right? This what I'm doing with you, that we can be grateful for the progress that has been made, and we can find ways to use the connections that we have so that we don't get completely cut off from each other. Society is human beings are terrible, right? We're awful, right? We're selfish, we're short-sighted, all that stuff. But humanity can be great if all of us just tries a little harder. so communicating, trying to understand. So this is the work of FPRI, the work of the World Affairs Council. I had to put in one plug there. The work of organizations that want to encourage greater understanding of what's going on around the world. This is part of what we can do to make ourselves better, to make the world a better place.
Love it. I will echo comment from Facebook. Emily Ann Streaker Troutman says, thank you for this refreshingly terrific and astute analysis. I have one final question, which is, what new hobby did you pick up during the quarantine?
Man, this is where I said human beings are terrible, right? That I have tried to exercise more.
Okay.
But, because I have been commuting from my house here, and I live in Westchester, going to Carlisle. That was 2 hours in each direction. And so now I feel like I have that much more time, so I can actually do some more exercising. The best thing is, I didn't
mean for that to be the one that put you on the spot.
No, that's all right. There has to be a question a guy can't answer. It's funny. What I've really enjoyed is, and my wife and I were talking about this earlier, is it's nice to know you don't have to go anywhere when you're able to be with people that you care about. And that's true. So I'll take that.
Awesome. Well, it's been an honor and a pleasure to chat with you. Thank you, Dr. Granieri. Lynn, I will turn it back over to you.
Okay. Thanks, Mike. I appreciate it. Thanks, Ron. Thanks, Mike Sutton, for your great emceeing capabilities. We really appreciate it. Just a quick reminder of 2 upcoming programs. On May 13th at noon, we're going to have China in Latin America, a great decisions discussion at noon with Dr. Stanley of Kutztown University. And on May 20th, another great decisions discussion on climate change at noon with Dr. Spencer Stober of Alvernia University. So we'll see you for those programs as well, I hope. So thanks for the members of the World Affairs Council of Reading attending, and thanks for other councils attending as well. This C/C Amplified program. Remember to support your local World Affairs Council, and for more information on events like this, check out cbycamplified.com. Good night, and thanks for joining us. We really enjoyed having you.
Thanks, everybody. Well, thanks, Mike. Thanks, Lynn. That was fun.
Ron. That was great. Yeah, I don't know how, Mike, do you have any idea how many people were out there from Facebook? I can't hear you.